The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head. Hello again there, folks. My name is Andrew Stewart. I'm here with you this week to bring you another exciting episode filled with joy and laughter and things that will get you thinking about all sorts of interesting matters for left progressives to think about. Before we dive into a fascinating interview that I think might shift some of your thoughts about any manner of matters, let's start off with two pieces of news this week that have been fascinating beyond belief. The first one comes out of a foul-mouthed little cretin weasel named Anthony Scaramucci, who has been appointed to President Trump's communications staff. Apparently his obnoxious presence was so substantial that it actually caused Sean Spicer to quit the White House. That itself is quite an accomplishment considering the guy in charge of that whole thing. Then it has led to the ouster of Reince Priebus, who has always been slightly slimier than a slug in my own diagnosis as a nasty sideshow carnival barker within the Republican Party establishment. Priebus was, as you may know, the White House Chief of Staff and head of one faction within the White House. Of course, Scaramucci, who kind of seems like some sort of version of the Fonz after a night of hard drinking, and crossbred with a white supremacist venture capital Looney Tune that you would find on Wall Street. He has gone out of his way to antagonize not just Priebus, but also Steve Bannon, and says that the utterly loathsome and quite frightening Steve Bannon, who sometimes reminds me of Jabba the Hutt, is involved in all sorts of self-filleting activities that I quite frankly find to be just fascinating in and of itself. You know, I'm getting to the point now where I'm walking out of meetings or pulling people aside at gatherings of a social sort, and I'm saying, did you guys see what's going on with this White House this week? This is becoming just like, did you see what that kid did in the locker room, what he did with that graffiti? Or, hey, did you hear about what Jimmy was doing with the girls up at the lake house this weekend? This is beyond belief. It's a crazy time to be an American, or a human being, apparently. Next up is the matter that has gotten quite a lot of attention, surprisingly, I must say, considering the really kind of ridiculous and pretty pathetic nature of the antagonizing agent in this, namely Caitlin Johnstone and her advocacy of building an alliance between the alt-right and the Green Party. This has been a matter that was discussed in multiple podcasts and pieces written on Counterpunch and other websites, and I have frankly found myself a bit torn in what to make of this individual. First of all, because Johnstone quite obviously is pretty stupid in what she says. If you read her writings or listen to some of her ramblings like this,
in my reality tunnel, the paradigm that we're trying to shift here has nothing to do with perfect people. We can't afford to be picky about what weapons we pick up. It's like picking up a rock to throw down from the castle walls and looking at it and going, wow, it's not exactly like the perfect shape and there's a little crack in here. We can collaborate with Trump people. We can collaborate with libertarians. We can collaborate with all sorts of people. They don't have to have the perfect philosophy and be the perfect person in order for us to collaborate. But if we elevate those people, the more we push those people into the machine, the more stuff we see. Hang on, I'll read some questions here. Progressives need to stop bickering over differences. Or are we snowflakes after all? Yeah. Let's just get on board. Let's go. We've got this. We had this. We had this when we were moving in a massive movement, and that's what scared the shit out of the oligarchy. This is a movement. Move forward. The more we look sideways at each other and start squabbling, the less movement we have forward. So where do we go to make progress? You go to Facebook. You make posts. You point out things. You use your inner sense maker to attune yourself to what is really going on, and to point out when something is weird and to point out when someone is doing something good, and just keep doing that. Just throw your guts into all of it, into all the people who are doing great things, and when they're not doing great things, don't give them any energy on that. Like the resistance chicks, okay? Like, they're a great example of people who aren't in our spectrum, our progressive spectrum. But you don't have to go and suddenly change your ideas on abortion just to align with them. They're up against the deep state, so you just keep pushing where they're pushing. Just surge. That's all we need to do. So push your energy at research, finding out what's going on, bringing that back to the group, doing your citizen journalism, getting your stuff out there as much as possible, sharing things that you find important, regardless of who they come from or where the outlet is or whatever, and just showing solidarity with this one thing that we're looking at. I mean, we're all united in this narrative because we're all united in our truth. So just keep pointing at truth. You don't have to worry too much about if someone gets, distracted by something else. And we will get distracted. People will have their different little things that pull them.
You will very quickly recognize that we are not dealing with a deep thinker here. So what I'm trying to figure out is if this is a person who is playing dumb so to promote kind of infiltration practices by the alt-right and fascists, which have a lick of credibility but also can verge a little bit on the side of the fantastic because of the fact that, there's a lot of people who would let people like Mike Cernovich right in the broad daylight walk into the front door of the White House, so why would they bother with the Green Party? I can't judge whether this is intentional or she's just kind of dumb and saying things she doesn't really understand the implications of. Either way, I think this is a tremendously bizarre suggestion and one that no sane adult would ever engage in. But because of the fact that we are in this juncture where we are seeing consistent level of suggestion around the idea of convergence and building a movement that is going to entail disenfranchised voters from across a political spectrum, as long as they oppose both neoliberalism and neo-fascism. I wanted to bring on today an interview with an individual who is actually pretty impressive in terms of not just his political economy, but the things he has done with it. So today I'm interviewing Gary Chartier. He's a left libertarian theorist and academic who is currently Distinguished Professor of Law and Business Ethics and Associate Dean of the Tom and V. Sapara School of Business at La Sierra University in Riverside, California. He is also a co-founder of the Center for a Stateless Society, and he and this Center for a Stateless Society are proponents of a type of individualist anarchism that provides a very interesting and dynamic vocabulary and grammar that can be useful for building these conversations with people who consider themselves of a libertarian bent. So, Gary, we are in a very strange political juncture where a lot of traditional mainstream political categories have just been collapsed within the 24 months up until now. What have you been seeing or reflecting on as a result of this bizarre election?
Bizarre doesn't begin to describe it, Andrew. We certainly are seeing a really striking loss of confidence in the political establishment. Ironically, of course, despite all the other things we might want to say about this, certainly it was really, really noteworthy that both the Sanders campaign and the Trump campaign took off during primary season in the way that they did, both, I think, reflecting a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction on the part of ordinary voters with the establishment candidates who were being served up for their consumption. If there's good news for us in the last few months, certainly it's that. It seems to me that there are voters who are really looking very critically at what's being treated as obvious and naturally acceptable by the media and so forth. On the other hand, of course, what we're also seeing is an explosion of fear around Senator on many different issues across the political spectrum. There seems to be a great deal of fear focused, on the one hand, on foreigners of all sorts, whether that comes to expression in support for nativism and nationalism of the kind that Trump certainly seems to want to support and to promote, or if it comes to expression, I think, in the fears that Trump's opponents seem to me to be trying to stir up regarding Russia. Also, of course, both Trump and his opponents in the Congress and in the media seem focused on very fearful attitudes toward Iran or North Korea. The politics of fear, unfortunately, can serve to unite people, and politicians have figured out for a long time that one of the greatest things they can do to promote their own success is to get people scared of some terrifying outsider. So those would be the first two things that would certainly occur to me. On the one hand, we're seeing a willingness on the part of the public to criticize established dogmas and politicians, but on the other hand, politicians across the board are seeking to unite people very often through appeals to fear.
Right. So with that in mind, one of the things that I've always found intriguing about the Center for a Stateless Society is that it serves as kind of this very interesting Rosetta Stone of sorts, because it can bring together people who come from a right side of the aisle trajectory in the libertarian tradition and a left trajectory, and provide sort of grammar and starting point for working together. And your book that you edited, Markets Not Capitalism, is a really great example of this. So can you explain what your intentions and thoughts were when you created the Center for a Stateless Society?
So first of all, let me not take credit for creating the center. I was involved pretty early on after the center came into being, but a number of other people were there at least as early as I was, and I certainly want to give them all the credit they deserve. A number of people who were involved there, including Roderick Long and Charles Johnson and Sheldon Richmond and Joe Stromberg and some others. But in any case, it seems to me that our view is that if you look at the history of political discourse, first of all in the U.S., since we're talking about a U.S.-based group, and we can expand out, obviously, to think about the rest of the world, but political discourse in the U.S., the people we think of as our ancestors intellectually and as activists, people like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner in the 19th century, were people who were very much involved in politically radical causes, not simply in challenging the plutocracy, but also in a variety of other social causes that were seen as very much on the fringe, women's rights and free love, and of course for Spooner, radical abolitionism. Tucker was a little too young for that. What happened for a whole range of, I think, unfortunate but pretty contingent historical reasons, was that the kind of radicalism that was represented by people like Spooner and Tucker in the U.S. Came to be muted, probably in one way or another, and the tradition that was rooted in their activism and their intellectual work and so forth came in the kind of the middle of the 20th century to be associated really with the American right wing, and really often to be associated in different ways, both with social conservatism and with a fairly unfortunate endorsement of some dodgy aspects of the status quo. And what we've been interested in doing is recapturing the radicalism of the 19th century American individualist anarchists and noting the ways in which these folks, who certainly have been seen to provide inspiration for some folks, who we might think of or who might have thought of themselves as being on the right, that despite that link, we really think that the claim that the American individualist anarchists like Spooner and Tucker are people who ought to be pretty exciting folks on the left, that's a claim that deserves a lot more attention. And we've sought to kind of recapture not only their radical critique of the plutocracy, but also at the same time their association with emancipation and inclusion across the kind of social space. So I think that's been our inspiration originally, and then we've on further energy from the alliances and relationships that have emerged since we began to embrace that vision and to sell it.
Okay. So there's a couple readings in that anthology that I've found particularly intriguing, and I was wondering if you could offer your thoughts in regards to them. The first one is 2 words on privatization, which puts forward the very interesting argument that when some libertarians say privatization, they do not mean necessarily what your traditional neoliberal, neoconservative, mainstream politicians mean.
Yeah, so here's an unfortunate reality we've discovered. Very often, the language of privatization seems to involve two things that we find problematic. The first of those is that very often talk about privatization seems to involve retaining a political unit's monopoly over some service or activity, with all the restrictive and problematic features that we might expect from a monopoly, but nonetheless contracting out the service to some preferred private business. So the result there is that maybe you get at the margins a more efficient performance of the service, but at the same time you retain the fundamentally problematic features of a monopoly, which folks claim to be opposed to, and yet are continuing to further under the guise of privatization. Another problem we notice, was especially evident, for instance, in say an environment like Russia after the collapse of communism, is that the process of privatization is not one in which the interests of workers and consumers are favored, but rather political cronies get special opportunities to feed at the trough and gobble up the resources that are being, quote, privatized. And so we had, let's say again in the Soviet Union, a situation in which for years the state had monopolized these various functions, had stolen from the public to support the delivery of these functions, had pumped a lot of money taken from ordinary people into them. But it now wasn't going to be the case that ordinary people would have any kind of realistic chance at getting access to these assets. Rather, they would be sold off sometimes at fire sale prices to the cronies of the new political elite. So privatization, I think, is the sort of thing that gets promoted in the abstract by folks who say that they are against the plutocracy, that they're in favor of freedom. And yet, very frequently, what we see instead is models of privatization that, again, on the one hand, in the U.S. context, privatization often ends up meaning we're going to contract out services that are, in fact, still monopolized. And in other contexts, as for instance in Russia, it often ends up meaning very dodgy arrangements that really support and further cronyism. And so, we've wanted to see, by contrast, models that really open up opportunities for genuine participation by workers and consumers, say in the U.S. context, to see services either, just opened up to a range of consumer options or, delivered either with consumer cooperatives or worker cooperatives. And, similarly in, say, a context like Russia, to see not the cronies of politicians, but say workers at state-owned enterprises involved in taking those enterprises over. So our view is that there really can be much more interesting options than the cronyish and monopolistic ones that often end up on the table.
Right. And so going off of that point, one of the other interesting reads in there is an essay titled Confiscation and the Homestead Principle. And can you explain the basic parameters of that essay?
Yeah, so that's an essay by Murray Rothbard, in which Rothbard wants to talk about what he sees as an appropriate mechanism for dealing with state property and what is both, so dealing with the jure state property and also with de facto state property. And so in the essay, he notes that John Kenneth Galbraith had proposed, I think, a threshold of 75% state participation in an enterprise as qualifying that enterprise as effectively a state enterprise. And Rothbard says, in effect, no, why not make it 50%, and why not treat the entities that really do feature this kind of state participation? And I suppose he's thinking of a whole range of entities that consistently seek and actively bring about this state participation. Obviously, can use state money in effect to lobby the state. Why not treat all of these as, in effect, right for homesteading? So there is a point in the article, I think, at which he allows for the possibility that there might be some kind of nationalization before this. I think that was just a bad idea. I think that opens up all kinds of possibilities for mischief. But what he does say, somewhat more plausibly, I think, is that where these entities clearly are creatures of the state, why not treat their assets as unowned and as right for homesteading by workers and consumers and others? So what he's trying to do is to lay out, though he wouldn't, because I think the word wasn't in common use at that time, he wants to offer a mechanism for privatization that really does open up the possibility for ordinary people to get involved in getting access to assets that really have been, in effect, acquired with stolen resources. And so he lays this out as a model that obviously could be applied in a variety of contexts.
Right, and he points to Tito's Yugoslavia as kind of a prime example.
Yeah, and, I don't think I have enough historical expertise to talk in detail about the way in which, worker self-management operated in Yugoslavia. My friend Carol Pateman wrote a great book now 46 years ago called Participation in Democratic Theory that involved a detailed examination, for instance, of the way in which the enterprises in Yugoslavia sort of worked politically. I can't assess the merits of what Rothbard had to say in that essay about Yugoslavia. I'll just say I think it's interesting and valuable that he was looking at those alternatives.
Are you able to explain perhaps what the individualist anarchist understanding of class is, as opposed to, say, more I'm not sure if it's traditional or particularly mass-based anarchist groupings, such as the IWW or something along those lines?
So, so the language of class doesn't probably show up as frequently in, let's say, in the earlier work of Tucker and others as it might in some of the work of the groups that you've talked about. But I think the idea of class is very much part of the way folks are thinking about things in the 19th century and earlier. This gives me very conveniently, Andrew, I hope you won't mind, an opportunity to plug a book that a number of us have just produced on this topic. David Hart of Liberty Fund, a wonderful historian who's done work on these issues for many, many years. Robert Long, philosopher at Auburn University, who's also at C4SS, and Ross Kenyon of C4SS as well, is an independent scholar and a filmmaker in Southern California. The four of us have edited a collection called Social Class and State Power, Exploring an Alternative Tradition, which collects historical and contemporary materials going back to the 17th century that try to document the pattern of class analysis that I think the individualist anarchists engaged in, but that was also very much a commitment of their predecessors and now of a variety of successors. And the crucial difference here, I suppose, is one in a sense of emphasis. In thinking about these matters, Karl Marx says at one point, a number of things that I have to say about the theme of class were anticipated by some earlier French liberal thinkers, but I've done a better job here, and I've said what needs to be said in the way that they haven't. And our view, I think, is, really there is something important that we really want to stress that's there in these earlier thinkers, again, going back to the English Civil War and through to the present. And the fundamental idea, I guess, as I try to put it in the course of a short interview, the fundamental feature of this account of class is that the state plays a constitutive role. Relationship to the state plays a constitutive role vis-a-vis class position. That if to take a really simplistic and stereotypical view, you might find other patterns of class analysis focusing just on the relationship between the sort of two-term relationship between a given group of people on the one hand and the means of production on the other, whereas the pattern of class analysis that again goes back to the English Civil War and certainly is highlighted by the individualist anarchists sees the relationship that people have precisely to state power as what's most important, and that will unavoidably have consequences for people's relationships then with the means of production. But what's really fundamental here is this link of state power, and so the idea is that it is precisely state that gives people illegitimate ties to productive capacity in one way or another. And so to take an obvious and simple example that would have been there very much in the work of, for instance, of Benjamin Tucker, Tucker talks about the what he calls the four monopolies, these monopolies that play an especially important role in empowering the plutocracy, but one that is controversial, but that we can talk about easily in making the point is intellectual property, which Tucker was, for various reasons, quite skeptical about. So here we have a situation in which there is, in effect, an artificial property right for Tucker that is created by state power, but then that, in effect, is conferred on those in a privileged relationship with the state. And so, of course, we understand that there are some writers, some artists who themselves really, because they've been tremendously successful, actually can use intellectual property personally in ways very profitable. But the reality is the bulk of intellectual property protections benefit, large conglomerates. I have a friend who's a musician who said to me years ago, at a point when she was working with large companies in the music business, said, look, if you download and copy my music, why should I care? I make money on concerts. It's the folks in the music business who really are making money off the albums. IP then is a classic example of ways in which productive assets are corralled and resources are constrained by state action. The state essentially confers a privilege on some people, the privilege to, in effect, control how other people use their stuff, that then empowers and enriches some who are the beneficiaries of state action. So I guess that's the kind of example of the sort of thing the tradition we're talking about has in mind. We can think of a variety of others. Tucker again had these four monopolies in Charles Johnson's essay, in the one of Charles's many great essays in Markets Not Capitalism. He range of other monopolies that ought to be added to the list. But the bottom line is state created and maintained privilege channels resources to the favored few.
One question, if you have probably come into contact with a lot of corporate libertarian party types who are very affirmative of their identity within the milieu of libertarianism that is not as far to the left and anti-capitalist as you might be. How have those conversations usually proceeded? I mean, in some regards, it's almost, do you find a lot of people that are interested in coming over to this cause, but also just is this an element of the discourse that is finding itself almost consistently embedded when anybody becomes a libertarian?
Yeah, libertarianism, like almost any political movement, is diverse, and I think what I've actually been pleasantly surprised by is that when I and my colleagues have made the kinds of points we're inclined to make here, there's definitely back from some people, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But I think we also find a great deal of sympathy for the kinds of things that we've wanted to say. I mean, the reality is, so obviously, capital L libertarians, libertarian party types, again, certainly include folks who are, much more comfortable with the status quo than we are. I'm always pleasantly surprised, frankly, how many folks, both within the party and within the broader movement, are really inclined to be very sympathetic to pretty radical critiques on a lot of fronts. We all have our preferred varieties of radicalism, and some things that we're comfortable with and some that we're not. But so first of all, I just want to be very clear that there's really a wide range of positions, and there's a lot of openness to genuinely radical critique. I do think that there is, what you've talked about as well, which we might find, especially perhaps among the proponents of what I would want to call a sort of vulgar objectivism. The objectivists here, folks who kind of identify with the intellectual legacy of Ayn Rand, do, I think, probably seize sometimes on the kind of rhetoric that you find in Rand, in which, she'll talk, say, for instance, famously about, big business is America's persecuted minority. And, this is things that, as Robert Long points out, isn't even consistent with other things Rand wants to say, but is obviously just inconsistent with what we observe about the political system. It's just absurd, and it's certainly worth criticizing. You definitely do have people who might feel comfortable with, again, what I'm calling, obviously not what they would call the sort of vulgar objectivism, who would look at the sort of approach we're taking and saying, you're just not taking seriously the heroic role that, big business plays in our lives and so forth. And, and there are people who, therefore, I think, tend probably to view what we're saying sort of contemptuously because of that. I guess we can live with that. People can be dismissive of us, and we can still, interestingly, sleep at night. But I think that we do notice that reaction, but we also notice a lot more, I think, openness to the kind of critique we want to offer, and the folks who take that view. All I guess you can do is really narrate the historical stories and really try to help people see more clearly what we can detect, the actual political dynamics of the economy in our society, and how it certainly doesn't, as a general matter, involve the sort of heroism that they're talking about.
Gotcha. So I know this might be almost typical or stereotypical, but how does the individual anarchist position envision itself, like, in relation to somebody like Noam Chomsky or Daniel Garin, who are seen as maybe figureheads or polar north of the anarchist tradition?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of us have learned a great deal from Chomsky as critic, right? I certainly have a lot of respect for what Chomsky's had to say across a variety of fronts, And I think the criticism of of U.S. government foreign policy, of the military-industrial complex, of corporatism within the economy, all of these things we would, I think, tend to look at very, very appreciatively and say, three cheers for Chomsky. I think we would then want to go on to say the sort of thing that Roderick Long says in a delightful little essay called Chomsky's Augustinian Anarchism. He notes that Chomsky can be compared to, perhaps unexpectedly, to St. Augustine. So Augustine tells us in his Confessions that early on in his life, as he was struggling with the new religious identity that he was moving toward, he would pray to God, "Give me chastity, but not yet." And there's a sense in which Roderick suggests in that article, we can see some of the things that Chomsky wants to say as saying, in effect, give me anarchism, but not yet. And that's because when Chomsky moves from critique to prescription, it seems sometimes as if what he has in mind is, over the short term, something at the domestic level that seems like a sort of familiar social democratic political program, perhaps a bit radicalized, that will then make the transition to anarchy. And the worry that I think we have about that view, as also, of course, about the similar kind of language that we get in traditional Marxism, is that strengthening the state doesn't seem like the best way to get rid of the state. We have I think the experience that people who get power very rarely want to let go of power. And so if you try to strengthen state institutions to accomplish this or that desirable goal, you run the risk, it seems to me, then, of solidifying the power of those who occupy positions in those institutions, and reducing the risk of reducing the likelihood of kind of movement beyond the state. So I think that again, I want to give Roderick full credit for talking about this in this way. We might want to think about the relationship between the plutocracy and the folks at the top of the pyramid of state power as very similar to the relationship between church and state in medieval Europe. They're both, as it were, jockeying for positions of preeminence, and yet at the same time we can see that they depend on each other for continued support, and they are in effect both allied against the people who are their subjects. We can see that in lots of contexts, certainly I think in medieval Europe, and the same kind of relationship between the plutocracy and the state plays out now. And so what we worry about then, I think, is an approach that we just say, well, let's just pick one side of that, when in effect both sides are really allied against us. So the bottom line is 3 cheers for Chomsky as a critic of foreign policy mischief, of the military-industrial complex, of media manipulation, of the plutocracy. But let's not then perhaps agree with specific policy prescriptions when those seem to involve just sort of furthering one side of the state plutocracy divide.
Right. Now, one of the things that has evolved over the last couple of years that has proven to be kind of a laboratory of what Murray Bookchin called libertarian municipalism has been the events in Rojava. And from what I gather, and I could be mistaken, apparently you have the disintegration of the state in many regards, but you still see the implements of the welfare state being given support by both the local economy created independent of the Ba'athist government, but also Ba'athist subsidies paying for, say, the teachers or
Mm-hmm.
administrative things. And I'm curious, how does the withering away of the state, in your mind, manage the implements of the welfare state that really provide a significant subsistence for certain groups within our society?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I can't comment on the specific example you've mentioned. It's intriguing and but not unfortunately something that I can kind of bring information about to the table. But what I would say, without having any illusions that I've in any way plumbed the depths here about the problem of economic vulnerability, I guess I'd note two things. First of all, it's clear that, as Charles Johnson emphasizes in another essay in The Market's Not Capitalism, an essay called Scratching By, all sorts of state policies tend to both create and perpetuate economic vulnerability and insecurity. And in a variety of ways, opportunities for people to do well economically at the kind of on the bottom rung of the ladder are minimized by state action that, let's say, for instance, limits opportunities to work in particular ways, limits opportunities to use one's own resources in ways that might be in one way or another economically productive. Also, we know that the state in various ways raises the cost of living for people, and therefore, again, makes economic vulnerability and insecurity more likely. We can think about the ways in which, I don't know, I'll just to take a random example from the American context. It was not that long ago that I was hearing about the ways in which professional firefighters in the Bay Area in California were having to sleep in homeless shelters and youth hostels because these people who, you might think normally are, really fairly well compensated were just unable to find affordable housing anywhere in the vicinity of their work. The ways in which housing prices have taken off in the Bay Area. And this isn't just some random innocent consequence of people looking for housing in a high demand area, but it's also unavoidably a function of the ways in which land use policies have really limited options. And of course, these are policies often promoted fairly self-righteously by folks who would think of themselves as thoroughgoingly liberal in the Bay Area, but who in effect are, in virtue of these policies, making life unaffordable. So all of these kinds of things happen on the one hand, then, to increase the need for involvement, on the part of, a whole range of people in addressing the problem of economic insecurity and vulnerability. At the same time, we know that in the 19th century America and 19th century UK, working class people did a great job of providing things like medical care and unemployment insurance through widespread mutual aid societies. It's not that these didn't work, why we don't see them now. Rather, what we saw was, on the one hand, let's say with medical care, the organized medical profession didn't like the fact that the practical effect of the arrangements being fostered by these mutual aid networks was to bring down the cost of medical care by reducing the compensation of physicians. And physicians who provided services to mutual aid networks were actually told they would be blackballed by other physicians because of the depressing impact on physician income. So in any event, mutual aid networks I think, demonstrated fairly clearly in 19th century America and parallel cases in England, the ability to address problems of economic insecurity and vulnerability. So if we think about, moving past the state and at the same time not leaving people in really vulnerable positions, it's just important, I guess, to emphasize, on the one hand, the way in which the state makes and keeps people poor, and on the other hand, the way in which, without state interference, people have shown the capacity to develop mutual aid networks that really have done the kinds of things that people have wanted done, in effect, in the same way through the state. So that doesn't deal, obviously, with issues of transitional dependence perfectly. That is, people have become accustomed, people haven't, let's say, been part of particular social networks or, have been disadvantaged in various ways by the kind of state action we talked about. And, that obviously creates transitional problems when you're getting rid of state institutions. And certainly my view would be that, in general, doing that, the last thing you want to be messing with is, those sorts of income support measures. I think they're all, it's one of the things that irritates me the most about a certain kind of right-wing rhetoric about state mischief is the degree to which folks want to talk about, somehow the social welfare system is the huge draw on the public purse, when they say nothing about the military-industrial complex and other things that take far, far more resources. So I'm certainly not in any way wanting to participate in a kind of knee-jerk attack on those social welfare institutions, but to suggest that the state really is the underlying problem, and that there's good evidence that society, rather than the state, has in the past and therefore presumably can in the future continue to provide income support in cases of vulnerability.
Right. One of the aspects of the individualist anarchist tradition that I found really interesting was its opposition to militarism and imperialism, and I was wondering if you could briefly touch on that.
Absolutely. I think that's been an unequivocal stance of people in this tradition from the beginning, as far as I can see. And obviously, you can see it as appealing from a whole range of angles. Right. On the one hand, I think that this is really to use words that some folks currently seem to find offensive, I'll use them anyway. It's a cosmopolitan and universalist tradition. It really believes that people have, moral standing, have dignity, have rights, whether they're on one side or another side of some arbitrary line drawn in the sand. And so we recognize from I think just a standpoint of justice and compassion, how truly awful war making is for people on the ground, almost without exception, the tremendous amount of death and destruction that happens to disrupt the lives of ordinary people. And so I think anyone who believes, as we do, in taking justice seriously, is going to find it very difficult to support war. But then, quite apart from that, we recognize the ways in which war making channels money to favored cronies of state actors, how it tends to solidify state power. I mean, you obviously just see the tremendous consolidation of state power in the United States since the beginning of the Bush wars in 2003. What we've seen is this concentration of power, the creation of the whole new kind of internal security, quote, homeland security, unquote, bureaucracy, and industrial complex to go along with the military industrial complex. And so there's been this, growing public acceptance, unfortunately, of everything from the mistreatment airline passengers to surveillance to detention without trial and so forth. So I would just say, we start out with a kind of anti-militarism and anti-imperialism that's rooted in our recognition of the fundamental kind of equality of authority of all people, their status as and the injustice of treating them in the ways that war and empire treat them. And then I think we go on to note the many side effects of prosecuting wars and other imperial misadventures, both domestically and abroad. And we really think that it's a tremendous shame that, again, in the U.S. context, I keep talking about the U.S. context because it's the one I know, not because I think it's the only one that genuinely cosmopolitan anarchists ought to be interested in. But, in the U.S. context, we've seen, this odd sort of seesaw having to do with militarism and imperialism that largely, if I can put it maybe in an unduly snarky way, you're opposed to militarism as long as your party isn't in charge. And so whenever, let's say, for instance, a party controls the White House and therefore controls the military, it's very, very hard to find any opposition to militarism on the part of, most major players in that party. Unfortunately, of late, we've seen, just the weird politics of the Trump era. Major Democrats are in general not taking any kind of, anti-militarist, anti-imperialist stance, even though they're not in the White House. I mean, the really kind of disappointing thing is that the only time Trump gets bipartisan support is when he, launches Tomahawk missiles at Syria. And in a sense, there's a press, I think, by some Democrats for Trump to be more aggressive and to rattle sabers more, at least in relation to Russia. So the major political parties in the U.S., but hardly just in the U.S., seem to get political capital out of engaging in militarist rhetoric and imperial mischief of all kinds. And it's really unfortunate to see that this has become a bipartisan commitment. It's one we're pretty passionately opposed to.
Gotcha. Are there any other points in conclusion that you wanted to bring up?
I think that the individualist anarchist tradition deserves more attention as a source of radical critique and insight, precisely because of the capacity that it's shown to bridge some traditional divides. Individualist anarchists, like Tucker and Spooner, are people I think it's easy for folks today to recognize as identified with some core concerns on the left. At the same time, the approach that the individualist anarchists and their successors have taken, certainly ought to have the position to war and empire and the plutocracy, people from elsewhere on the political spectrum. The great and somewhat unclassifiable upstate New York political writer Bill Kaufman, in many of his works, has talked about the way in which he sees hippies and unschoolers, gun right people and drug rights people as really having more in common than they tend to recognize because of cultural divides that very often make them think about each other as adversaries. And I think there's definitely something to that, and I think the individualist anarchists provide a sort of bridge and a kind of space within which people with maybe some interesting cultural differences can nonetheless see political common ground. I really believe that I've got certainly some cultural commitments in areas like like gender equality, like inclusion for lesbian, gay, and bisexual and trans people and so forth. I had commitments there that, might make some other folks uncomfortable. At the same time, I think that despite the sort of cultural differences that Kaufman talks about, the individualist anarchist approach really ought to provide a basis for common ground for a lot of people who really see the deeply destructive mischief-making of the warfare state and the plutocracy and want to challenge that. I hope that conversations that make that kind of common ground possible will continue, and I'm obviously really grateful for the chance to participate in one today. So thank you very much.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.